In the year 1515, amid the splendor of the French court, a hushed whisper spread through the corridors of royal chambers. Charles Brandon, a trusted favorite of England's King Henry VIII, had just taken a daring step that could have cost him his fortune, or even his life. He had quietly married Mary Tudor, the Dowager Queen of France and the King's own beloved younger sister, without royal permission. Though overshadowed by the larger drama of Tudor politics and the imposing figures surrounding Henry VIII, Charles Brandon's choice to wed Mary in secret is a revealing glimpse into a life defined by ambition, charm, risk-taking, and remarkable good fortune. This unexpected marriage set tongues wagging across Europe. Even Francis I, the new French king, reportedly found it both scandalous and fascinating. Brandon's breach of royal protocol could have spelled his undoing. Yet, in a testament to the depth of his bond with Henry VIII and perhaps his uncanny ability to navigate the perils of court life, he not only survived the scandal but thrived in its aftermath. This singular act hints at why Charles Brandon, 1st Duke of Suffolk, remains a compelling historical figure. His story, though less frequently told than the grand sagas of monarchs and national events, offers a window into the complexities of the Tudor age, an era of shifting alliances, personal ambition, and political maneuvering. Today, as we look back on the chaos and brilliance of that epoch, Brandon's life reminds us how personal choices, strong relationships, and the capacity to balance humility with cunning could mean the difference between glory and ruin. His experiences still hold a relevance that resonates, encouraging us to reflect on themes of loyalty, friendship, and the weight of personal daring in the face of towering political power. Charles Brandon was born around 1484 into a world still trembling from the Wars of the Roses, a period of prolonged civil strife between the houses of Lancaster and York. England at the time was in flux, just beginning to emerge under the newly consolidated Tudor dynasty. The final decisive event that had brought the Tudors to power occurred in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where Brandon's father, Sir William Brandon, served as Henry Tudor's standard-bearer. This was no small role. In the swirl of swords and the chaos of that pivotal battle, William Brandon lost his life, reportedly cut down by King Richard III himself, while bearing Henry Tudor's royal standard. This heroic final act bound the Brandon family's fate to that of the victorious Tudors. In recognition of his father's sacrifice, the young Charles was taken under the protective wing of the new regime. He would grow up in close proximity to the future King Henry VIII, learning courtly manners, the arts of jousting, and the critical art of reading a royal mood. It is said that from a young age, Charles Brandon possessed a disarming blend of physical prowess, good humor, and unaffected charm. These traits made him a favorite companion to Prince Henry, a boy equally spirited and prone to the enthusiasms of youth, whether in sports, music, or dance. The Tudor court of Henry VII was far more austere than what would develop under Henry VIII, but it was also a place of cunning and calculation. Brandon, as he navigated these halls, learned that forging powerful friendships could not only boost one's social standing, but might well secure personal safety. Surviving in a court rife with hidden rivalries required tact. Yet Brandon's youthful confidence was tempered with a certain genuineness that seldom made him enemies. He was also taught to be mindful of the line between confidence and insolence, an essential lesson for anyone so close to the throne. These early experiences shaped a young man who understood how to leverage personal appeal without alienating those upon whom he depended. Furthermore, a life spent near the prince gave Brandon an insider's perspective on the changing cultural landscape of the early 16th century. Europe was on the cusp of the Renaissance, and through Henry VIII's circle, Brandon was exposed to new ideas about chivalry, religion, and humanistic learning. It is little wonder that when Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, Charles Brandon was perfectly positioned to benefit from a new reign, eager to establish an image of youthful vitality and grandeur. When King Henry VIII came into power, he brought with him a thirst for Renaissance ideals, flamboyant displays of wealth, grand tournaments, and a visible sense of magnificence that projected England onto the European stage. Brandon flourished in this environment. One of the first key events that showcased both his talents and the king's personal affection was the lavish tournaments of Henry's early reign. Brandon distinguished himself as a skilled jouster, praised for his technique and knightly bearing. Jousting, for the Tudors, was more than a simple game. It was a highly symbolic martial display of courage, prowess, and loyalty. The king's favor, shown publicly to a jousting champion, could carry immense prestige. Brandon's repeated successes in the lists earned him Henry's esteem, as did his unfailing courtesy and willingness to take risks that others dared not. This combination of skill and daring made Brandon almost indispensable as an emblem of the robust new Tudor monarchy. His first major step up the ladder of titles came in 1513, during the War of the League of Cambrai against France. Brandon, by then recognized for his martial and diplomatic gifts, was part of Henry's entourage on the continent. Though not yet of the highest nobility, he had made a name for himself on the battlefield and in negotiations. By the time the brief conflict concluded, his reputation as a trustworthy royal servant had been sealed. His star rose further in 1514, when Henry VIII created him Viscount Lisle, a noble distinction that emphasized the king's intention to elevate his friend into the higher echelons of English aristocracy. It was also a signal to the wider court that Charles Brandon was someone to watch, someone the king might rely upon when delicate tasks needed doing, or when Henry himself wanted to embark on a new endeavor outside the bounds of typical decorum. That next delicate task soon presented itself. In 1514, Henry had brokered a marriage between his younger sister, Mary Tudor, and Louis XII of France. Mary, reportedly fiercely opposed to the union at first, eventually consented out of a sense of familial duty. The marriage was a political arrangement intended to secure temporary peace with France. Still, there were rumors that Mary harbored a deep affection for Charles Brandon and would only wed the French king on the condition that, if she became a widow, she might choose her next husband according to her own heart's desire. Louis XII, aged and in poor health, died on January 1st, 1515, just months after taking Mary Tudor as his wife. That is when the real intrigue began, for Mary and Brandon, both now in France, saw an opportunity to unite quickly before King Henry VIII or the French court could interfere. They married in secret, an act that, without the king's prior blessing, violated a host of diplomatic protocols. Francis I, the new French monarch, was amused by their actions, but what truly mattered was Henry's reaction back in England. One might assume that King Henry would have erupted with fury upon discovering his sister's clandestine wedding, and indeed there was outrage at first. Brandon faced the genuine possibility of dire consequences, imprisonment, ruin, or worse. But, in a remarkable turn of events, the king's affection for Brandon, combined with Mary's skill in negotiation, managed to dissipate Henry's rage. They offered the king a hefty financial settlement, paid in installments, which served as a form of restitution. This agreement restored royal favor, though it also left Brandon with a substantial debt. Still, it was a small price to pay for surviving what could have been an act of treason in the eyes of a less forgiving monarch. In recognition, Henry VIII elevated Brandon further in 1514 by creating him Duke of Suffolk, one of the highest-ranking titles in England. This marked a significant rise for a man whose father had died on the battlefield as a loyal banner carrier for Henry VII. Shortly thereafter, Brandon served as a leading figure in one of the most spectacular events of Henry VIII's reign, the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520. Held between the towns of Ardres, English territory, and Gien, French territory, in northern France, this was a grand meeting between Henry VIII and Francis I designed to showcase the wealth and power of each monarchy. In a festival of jousting, feasting, and elaborate tents, Brandon again made his mark, impressing observers with his skill in the lists. He is said to have unhorsed some of the finest French knights, thus reinforcing England's martial prestige in a setting designed to awe the entire European continent. This period, often considered the pinnacle of Tudor cultural display, featured Charles Brandon in a central role, reflecting both his high status and the king's continued trust. Yet for all the pageantry, Brandon's life was not devoid of personal tragedy or emotional struggle. Before his marriage to Mary Tudor, he had been married twice and betrothed once, sometimes under complicated circumstances that reveal the fluid and at times precarious arrangements of the Tudor nobility. For instance, Brandon was at one point betrothed to Elizabeth Grey, whose title Viscount Lisle he later adopted for himself with the king's agreement, though the match did not ultimately stand. Scandals and rivalries often percolated around Brandon's personal affairs, though his closeness to the monarch typically shielded him from lasting harm. Still, it was a persistent source of moral and legal wrangling that would be seized upon by enemies whenever they sensed an opportunity. One lesser-known story from this era involves Brandon's discreet assistance to certain courtiers who fell out of Henry VIII's favor. While he was never overly vocal in defending those who lost the king's trust, documents hint that Brandon quietly interceded on behalf of certain families or individuals when he believed a softer approach might move Henry away from harsh retribution. This suggests a measure of compassion and political finesse. For example, there is an account, though not definitively proven, that Brandon wrote a private plea for a condemned noble's family, urging the king to show leniency toward the children and widow. Such gestures reveal a side of Brandon that might not be apparent from his reputation as a bold soldier and courtier. They illustrate his capacity to temper loyalty with humanity and to realize that alliances could be bolstered by small acts of mercy. Another fascinating yet under-discussed element of Brandon's life was his complex relationship with Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the powerful Lord Chancellor and the king's right-hand man during Henry's early reign. Wolsey, who had the ear of the king in matters both ecclesiastical and political, is reputed to have found Brandon's rise somewhat vexing. The cardinal came from relatively humble origins himself, but he prided himself on intellectual acumen and administrative skill. Brandon, by contrast, was not known for extraordinary scholarship. His talents lay in the more direct spheres of combat, jousting, courtly display, and personal diplomacy. Nevertheless, the two men managed a working alliance that underscored the king's ability to balance different personalities within his inner circle. Wolsey likely recognized that Brandon's close friendship with Henry VIII made him in effect untouchable. Any direct confrontation with the Duke of Suffolk risked souring Wolsey's own standing with the king. Over time, a certain mutual respect formed, although tensions lurked beneath the surface. When Wolsey fell from grace in the late 1520s for failing to secure the king's annulment from Catherine of Aragon, Brandon was among the nobles who helped orchestrate the cardinal's downfall, publicly demonstrating loyalty to Henry and aligning with the faction that believed Wolsey had outlived his political usefulness. Despite his noble title and consistent favor, Brandon was not immune to the darker undercurrents of Tudor politics. The 1530s witnessed Henry VIII's break with Rome, the rise of Anne Boleyn, and the subsequent transformation of the realm's religious identity. The dissolution of the monasteries and the ongoing religious reforms brought enormous upheaval, especially to those still loyal to Catholic traditions. Although Charles Brandon is not primarily remembered for deep religious convictions, he was inevitably drawn into the controversies of the time. As a trusted noble, he served the crown by helping to enforce new policies, quell uprisings, and redistribute monastic lands. Given that property once belonging to the church was seized by the crown and granted to favored courtiers, Brandon found himself as a beneficiary of these redistributions, further increasing his wealth and territorial influence. Yet while there is no indication that religion was a primary driving force in Brandon's life, these years tested his commitment to Henry's revolution in church-state relations. Standing apart from radical reformers, Brandon maintained a stance of pragmatic loyalty. As the king went, so went the Duke of Suffolk. One of the most challenging moments that tested his loyalty came in 1536 with the Pilgrimage of Grace, a large-scale rebellion in northern England sparked by opposition to the dissolution of the monasteries and other perceived injustices of the Tudor regime. Brandon played a significant part in putting down this rebellion. He led royal forces to suppress outbreaks of discontent and to negotiate with rebel leaders. Although the final resolution involved a mix of threats, diplomacy, and subsequent betrayal of rebel promises, Brandon performed his tasks faithfully. Some accounts suggest he showed restraint and even regret in his dealings, as many of the rebels were ordinary subjects who felt genuinely betrayed by their king's new religious policies. Yet Brandon was duty-bound to enforce Henry's will. Not all historians agree on the extent to which he may have shown clemency or brutality in quelling the uprising, and it remains a point of debate. Still, the outcome left many rebel leaders facing execution, while Brandon sustained his position within the king's confidence. These controversies highlight the moral complexity of serving a monarch as mercurial as Henry VIII. Balancing personal ethics with the demands of royal obedience was a constant challenge for nobles in the Tudor era. Brandon had neither the scholarly defense of the church nor the theological fervor of a reformist. In many respects, he exemplified the knightly aristocrat whose first loyalty was to the monarch. Because of his unwavering service, Henry VIII continued to rely on him for sensitive tasks, including diplomatic missions and occasionally more forceful interventions. Nonetheless, the price of power in the Tudor court was perpetual vigilance. Any misstep or any wavering in loyalty risked the sudden wrath of a king who had, over time, grown increasingly autocratic and suspicious. Throughout these years, Brandon's relationship with Mary Tudor remained a notable aspect of his personal life. She was often described as beautiful, spirited, and firm in her opinions. Despite initial royal disapproval, their marriage evolved into a genuine partnership. Though Mary's health began to decline in later years, their union was reputedly happy by the standards of the time. They had 4 children together, and Mary contributed substantially to Brandon's social standing through her royal connections and personal grace. Tragically, Mary died in 1533 at the age of 37, leaving Brandon widowed. King Henry VIII's sister had given him not just personal happiness, but also ties to the crown itself that no amount of political maneuvering could replicate. The loss undoubtedly dealt a major blow to Brandon, though outward displays of deep personal grief among Tudor nobles were often tempered by the demands of public duty. He remarried soon after Mary's passing, to Catherine Willoughby, a noblewoman of the same courtly sphere. This marriage further solidified Brandon's position and lineage, although it generated some controversy due to the relatively swift time frame after Mary's death. In the Tudor world, however, rapid remarriages were not uncommon, driven by the need to secure alliances and produce heirs. Brandon's personal vulnerabilities and inner struggles are not as extensively documented as those of Henry VIII or Anne Boleyn, who have captured greater historical imagination. Yet glimpses emerge from letters and court records. Contemporary observers comment on Brandon's loyalty and politeness, and some mention his occasional flare-ups of temper when he perceived an injustice to a friend or an attack on his honor. A Venetian diplomat once described him as gentle in speech yet vigorous in action, a man who could just as easily delight a courtly audience as he could command men on the battlefield. Fragments of personal correspondence hint at occasional financial anxiety, stemming in part from his earlier debts to the king and from the fluctuating expenses of maintaining ducal estates and a lifestyle befitting his rank. In these concerns, Brandon was no different from many Tudor nobles who walked a tightrope between luxurious display and the dire consequences of insufficient funds. As Henry VIII aged, the dynamics of the court changed yet again. New factions arose competing for influence over the succession and the direction of the English Reformation. Brandon, now one of the king's longest-serving confidants, found himself transitioning from the exuberant knight of Henry's youth to a more measured statesman. His children would occupy places at court, and his alliances through marriage extended into the webs of Tudor family politics. In particular, his daughter Frances Brandon, born of his marriage to Mary Tudor, would become the mother of Lady Jane Grey, famously known as the 9 Days Queen, after Henry VIII's death. This genealogical connection placed Brandon's descendants close to the throne, albeit with catastrophic consequences for Lady Jane Grey in 1554. While Brandon did not live to see that tragedy, the seeds of his lineage had been inextricably woven into the tapestry of Tudor succession struggles. In evaluating Charles Brandon's life, historians have long debated how much influence he truly wielded behind the scenes. Some suggest that while he was close to Henry VIII, he lacked the intellectual or strategic brilliance of figures like Wolsey or Thomas Cromwell. Instead, Brandon's power stemmed from personal rapport with the king, the intangible glue that bound them together since childhood. Others argue that Brandon should not be underestimated. His skills in negotiation, warfare, and maintaining an even temperament in a court that devoured the weak speak to a shrewdness beyond simple good fortune. The controversy lies in whether he was merely an amiable companion for Henry VIII or a capable statesman in his own right. Contemporary accounts vary, and modern scholars continue to parse evidence from royal proclamations, property records, and personal correspondence to assess the Duke of Suffolk's true legacy. Each perspective acknowledges, however, that his closeness to the king granted him unusual protection and opportunities, a privilege that comparatively few ever enjoyed for so long. Another area of debate concerns Brandon's loyalty during the many phases of Henry's reign, especially during the shifts in religious policy. Did his lack of overt zeal for or against the Reformation reflect a politically expedient neutrality, or did it indicate a more personal ambivalence? Critics might label him opportunistic, pointing to his willingness to accept grants of former monastic lands. Supporters, meanwhile, might applaud his consistency in serving the monarchy, seeing in him a man who recognized that real power lay in preserving the existing social order while adapting to necessary changes. This tension reflects broader questions about how nobility navigated the unpredictability of the Tudor court. In truth, he was likely a combination of both, a man deeply loyal to the king and realm, but also pragmatic enough to ensure his own survival and prosperity. Charles Brandon died on August 22, 1545, at Guildford, not long before Henry VIII's own death in early 1547. If the king mourned him in private, there is no grand record of that grief. Henry himself was in precarious health by then, surrounded by the challenges of selecting his final advisors and grappling with the uncertain future of his heir, the young Prince Edward. Nonetheless, Brandon's passing closed a chapter on one of the most enduring and unusual friendships of the Tudor age. For decades, he had managed to retain the king's affection, secure major titles, and play a role in almost all of the great events of Henry's reign, from the French wars to the sweeping religious transformations. He was unique among Henry's favorites in never completely falling from grace, a remarkable achievement given the fate of many others who found themselves on the scaffold or consigned to political oblivion. Brandon's significance today may be less recognized by the general public than that of Henry VIII or Anne Boleyn, yet for those studying the Tudor period, he is an indispensable figure. He exemplifies the virtues and vices of a courtly noble who had to balance martial prowess, diplomatic skill, and unwavering loyalty. He also illustrates the personal dimension of Tudor politics, showing how a monarch's whims and a noble's fate could be intertwined through ties of friendship or family. On a cultural level, Brandon played an integral part in many of the most dazzling moments of Henry's reign, whether as a champion in tournaments or a participant in royal ceremonies, like the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Even on a broader societal stage, his example underscores how the Tudors extended their influence to a circle of favored courtiers, reshaping the nobility through a mix of royal grants, marriages, and political appointments. His legacy is further secured by his descendants, most notably through Francis Brandon and Lady Jane Grey, connecting him to the tragic shifts in succession that followed Henry's death. Although Charles Brandon did not live to witness the short rule and eventual execution of his granddaughter Jane, his lineage bore witness to the brutal realities of Tudor succession politics. In this sense, his family story encapsulates the precarious nature of favor at court. Even the highest titles and closest relationships to the royal line could not guarantee safety when new factions emerged or the crown changed hands. For contemporary viewers reflecting on Brandon's story, there are valuable lessons in loyalty, adaptability, and the delicate interplay between personal ambition and moral duty. Many of us can identify with the challenge of balancing obligation to a superior or an institution with personal values and relationships. Brandon's journey resonates through time as it highlights how friendship, courage, and a certain lightness of spirit can carry one through the harshest climates of political life. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.